In traditional Chinese society, obedience to proper authority, whether in the family or in society at large, was a fundamental duty for all Chinese citizens. For women, this meant that, as daughters, they owed obedience to their fathers, as wives to their husbands, and as widows to their eldest sons. Despite the efforts of the Qing emperors to stamp it out, the practice of foot binding of women was widespread by the early 20th century. Arranged marriages, often involving the payment of a dowry, were common. Rich and powerful men kept mistresses as well as wives. Before the 20th century, few Chinese women were able to receive any kind of education. The lives of peasant women were particularly harsh. As well as bearing the burden of child rearing and household work, they were expected to labor in the fields and carry on handicraft work at home. However, under the rule of Mao, China saw a number of changes that challenged the traditional view of what it meant to be a Chinese woman. The traditional prejudice against women followed through into Mao's reign regardless. For every gain women appeared to make, there seemed to be an accompanying disadvantage. Now that they were officially regarded in Mao's China as the equals of men, they could be called on to do the work of men. Between 1949 and 1976, the proportion of women in the workforce quadrupled from 8 to 32%. This might bring them advantages if the work was suitable, but if it was heavy physical labor, then they were no better off than before. Entrenched values and attitudes are hard to change in any country. China was by tradition a male-dominated society. No matter how genuine the new communist regime might be in declaring that the sexes were equal, women still had to compete with deep-seated Chinese notions of female inferiority. This was clearly evident in the common prejudice against female babies. It was the wish of nearly all Chinese couples to have male children. The birth of a boy was thought to bring honor on the family and the promise of another source of income. On the other hand, girls were still seen as a drain on resources.
In addition to women being denied a fuller political role, there was a deeper sense in which the policies followed under Mao prevented the women in China from making a sustained advance. If anything, the radical character of Mao's reform program increased their vulnerability. Collectivization entailed a direct and deliberate assault on the traditional Chinese family. Mao had already prepared the way for this as early as 1944 when he had stated that it is necessary to destroy the peasant family. Women going to the factories and joining the army are part of the big destruction of the family. While in some respects this might be considered liberating since women were freed from the family ties that had restricted them, the enforced social change happened all too suddenly. The Chinese, a profoundly conservative people, became disorientated. Women found themselves detached from their traditional arena. Many felt unhappy that their role as mothers and raisers of families was now to be wholly devalued.
The Chinese communist officials proclaimed themselves to be supporters of female equality. The first act that the PCR introduced was the new marriage law. This meant that the practice of all men having mistresses became illegal. Arranged marriages were discontinued, and this also included that all women in arranged marriages had the option to divorce. The new freedom that was granted to women to divorce and remarry a certain number of times meant that in some cases women would have as many as 4 husbands in a number of years. This proved to be so disruptive that the PCR decided to add a clause to the new marriage law. The clause added the regulation that if you were a soldier in the PCR army, you had the right to overrule your wife's decision to divorce you. In the 1950s, more laws were passed for women's equality. Women were given the right to own and sell land and property. However, this apparent gain was undermined by Mao's massive cultivation program, which was accompanied by the Great Leap Forward. This abolished private property and required people to give up all private property and live in communes. The communes brought one advantage for women. It meant that everybody ate in mess halls, meaning that women would no longer have the daily burden of finding food and having to prepare it.
There were additionally unchanging peasant attitudes that worked unfavorably towards women. Peasants complained that the new marriage laws were interfering with the established ways of life. Female subordination was the norm in all China's rural areas, but especially so in the western provinces, where there was a predominantly Muslim culture. In areas such as Jiangshan, families were tightly controlled by the men. Female members were subject to the orders of husbands, fathers, and brothers, and even brothers-in-law. 30 years after Mao's death, the representative of the All China Women's Federation described the outlook of Jiangshan's 4 million women as being like a frog in a well. All they can see is a tiny bit of sky, so their outlook is very narrow. A woman is treated as a man's possession. Despite the CCP's public advocacy of women's rights, feminists observe that in practice, Mao and his party operated a male-dominated system. An example being the infrequency with which women were granted government and party posts. During Mao's time, women made up only 13% of the membership of the Communist Party. The number of women who became members of the National People's Congress did rise under Mao from 14% to 23% between 1954 and 1975. But this was not at a rate to suggest that the CCP had made a priority of promoting females within its ranks.